does the soul exist? Is there really a mysterious, intangible substance that circulates our bodies? Is the soul the source of our human consciousness, our emotions, our judgments, our sense of self? Does it define who we are? If you look at the Quran, the answer provided will stun you. If you scan scientific literature and other sources, you find that there are indications that the traditional understanding of the soul is being challenged. Many scientists consider the soul to be unscientific, outdated, and a primitive concept. Ancient cultures must have noticed there's a difference between living and non-living things. And they postulated that it must be some kind of a life force, a mysterious, invisible life force that's responsible for the life phenomenon. So the soul is the seat of our humanity. It's the sense of self, it's our individuality. And the soul controls the body like an operator controls a machine. And in the 17th century, Descartes, which is a French mathematician, introduced the concept of dualism. According to this understanding, a human being consists of two distinct entities, a physical, material body and a non-physical mind or soul. And these are two fundamentally different concepts. There was an immediate problem here. How does the mind or the soul control the physical body? What is the nature of this interaction? They are two separate entities. What is the Quran approach? We find that in 3677, God poses the rhetorical question, do you not then see that God creates you from a minimal quantity of liquid containing a fertilized egg, and lo, the same man becomes endowed with the power to think and argue? So God appeals here to us to reflect on this amazing transformation from our simple biological origin to a complex being endowed with consciousness, as indicated by the words think and argue. To understand this verse properly, we need to just briefly look at another concept known as the multi-level description unit concept. What it basically says is that we are multi-component systems. If you look at the brain, for example, it consists of several levels. At its fundamental level, there's the protons, the neutrons, and the electrons. And these come together, interact with each other, producing atoms and molecules. Atoms and molecules combine with each other, and they constitute complex living molecules, which constitute a nerve cell. Chunks of nerve cells produce the brain tissue. If I ask you, where is the thought amongst the protons, the neutrons, and electrons, you won't be able to find a thought there because it exists at the lower level of analysis. Only when the brain is considered in totality does the higher function emerge, such as thought processes. It's like a picture, If you have a picture consisting of a large number of dots, if you just use a small number of dots and you put them together in a random fashion, you're not going to see anything meaningful. Put all the dots together in a specific order, then a lively picture emerges. Similarly, consider a DNA molecule. It consists of billions of lifeless atoms. And you put them together in the correct order. That is the key, correct order. A DNA molecule is formed which still consists of lifeless atoms, but now it starts to copy itself, replicate, and transmit information. In other words, it reveals now characteristics of something that's alive. This is one of the most profound new insights of modern science, where the multi-level description concept explains how non-living things can become alive without invoking a living force such as the soul. If you consider the system holistically, then a dimension emerges which is not present amongst the individual components. In other words, put these things together in a proper order, something amazing happens. It starts to reveal living characteristics. Chapter 36, verse 77 is an echo of the multi-level description principle. At the advanced level is consciousness, which is an outflow of the sperm drop which is a lower level of physical existence. This idea is supported by another verse in chapter 80, verse 19, which says, "It is God that creates you from minimal quantum liquid containing a fertilized egg and lays down the plan." In the context, the genetic plan, which decides the features of the organism and its shaping and proportioning. So the fertilized egg contains the genetic instructions. In other words, it's the DNA that in turn determines the features of the animal. In other words, specifies the species type. You are human because of human DNA, plant has plant DNA, and chimp has chimp DNA, and so on. And this is something amazing because our essential humanity, therefore, is traceable to our genetic makeup. It is rooted in our genes. So it has in other words, a biological basis. There's nothing being said here about a living force being inserted at some time or another into an organism. Now let's look at the life of the human being in the embryo. Now I've discussed this in a video before. You can check out my video on embryology. What the Quran is describing there is the 5 stages of embryogenesis, which include fertilization, implantation, the placental stage, gastrulation, and the formation of somites. When the Quran describes the stages, proceeds and talks about the formation of bone and muscle, and then it makes the following statement. It says, "And after that, we develop out of it a new creation." This marks the stage of divergence, where the human being embarks on a new stage of development, becoming distinctly human. It's probable that at this stage, this marks the beginning of the seed of human consciousness. It is interesting that during this stage, a particular gene is activated, which controls brain development. And it's during this stage that the human brain experiences a rapid increase in size and a complexification. So the stages described so far happen in all the embryologies. But when the Quran says, then we develop out of it a new creation, this then happens only in the human brain and not in the other embryologies. So again here, nothing is said about some soul being inserted into the embryo. Now this suggests that during this stage that neural changes are taking place. There's a reorganization of the brain, and consciousness, as I says, begins, but in a rudimentary form, which will develop at a later stage as the child is exposed to life experiences and so on. Now, I think it's appropriate at this stage to introduce a concept of soul attachment. Now, when does the soul attach to the embryo? If it happens, say at fertilization, then there's a number of questions we must ask ourselves. Where does the soul originate from? That's the first question. Second question is, how does it know which fertilized egg to infiltrate? In this infiltration process, what is the physiological basis? Now, once the soul takes up residence in the cell, what happens if the cell divides? Does the soul also divide, or does it diffuse into the other cell? What happens with identical twins? Does the soul split into 2? Sextuplets, does the soul split into 6? Some scholars have assigned different numbers as to when ensoulment is supposed to take place. Aristotle is of the opinion that the soul inserts into the embryo at 80 days. Thomas Aquinas, which is a Christian scholar, this ensoulment happens at 40 days. Muslim scholars, clearly influenced by these pagan philosophers, they say, or they postulate, that it happens at 40 days or 6 weeks. As I said, nothing, again, I must stress this, when the Quran describes all these stages, there's no mention made of any invisible force coming from the outside. Let us look at evolution. According to evolution, we as highly developed beings evolve from less organized forms of life. We've discussed embryology involves the development of an individual. Evolution involves the origin of a species. One of the striking features of human evolution is the almost fourfold increase in brain size over a 3 millennia period. Now, this increase in brain size is not just a mere expansion of the brain, but there's a total reorganization of the brain taking place. So if you study the brain, you find its structure reveals its developmental history. In primitive organisms, the first part of the brain that develops is that of the spinal cord, which is chiefly to do with reflex activity. As the spinal cord enlarges upwards and expands, it gives rise to the brainstem, which is the seat of primitive intelligence, controlling movement and vital functions. As the organisms ascend the evolutionary scale, reptiles evolve. A new structure was laid down called the R complex. It doesn't happen overnight, it's a long process. And the R complex is the seat of territoriality and aggression. The brainstem and the R complex, R for reptile, are kept by the limbic system. The limbic system is the seat of our emotions and feelings and affection. It's present in all mammals. It represents a new part of brain development. It's present in all mammals. The most recent part of brain development is that of the cerebral cortex, which represents about 80% of the brain of advanced animals, including humans. Now, this is the seat of our humanity, of our consciousness, and this where the advanced functions take place, like thinking, speech, contemplation, so on. So what we can say is that parallel with the physical transformation in the brain was a gradual mental progression. As the brain enlarged and became more organized, consciousness increased, and behavioral and social patterns became more intricate and complicated. So we see, therefore, that the intelligence and cognitive functions co-evolve intimately with brain changes. If the Quran, which gives so much support to evolution, if this is true, then an evolution and the idea of a soul is incompatible. Then it means that we are compelled to believe that the Quran rejects the soul hypothesis. Now, this is an astounding conclusion with serious implications for the religious community. We've always believed that we are endowed with a sacred life force, the soul. The soul has other serious difficulties. It's a poorly defined concept because it's often used interchangeably with spirit or mind. The soul is also not subject to scientific analysis and therefore cannot be tested. Any theory that you cannot test is a weak one. Moreover, how does an intangible substance like the soul stimulate the brain? How does it know which part to affect? And how does the physical brain interact with the soul? There is no physiological basis for this interaction. Now, if you look at the evolutionary record, as we said, we spoke about the brain increase in brain size, which is based on fossil studies and archaeological record. Is there an incident which we can define as a moment when ensoulment was supposed to have taken place? Can we identify such a moment? And the answer is a definite no. In fact, there is no such evidence. Evidence points to the contrary, that is of gradualism, that humans develop over hundreds of thousands of years, and our civilization and also progressed in stages. So if, as commonly believed, the soul is the center of our humanity, is our sense of self, our individuality, if that is so, and ensoulment did take place, that God blew his spirit into the first human Adam, there should have been an unparalleled increase in all kinds of activities at a particular stage about 6,000 years ago, according to creation theory. We find no such evidence. As I said, the whole picture is of gradualism. Given the slow process of the development of the brain and intelligence, the smooth-like transition from a primitive consciousness in our early ancestors to a complex modern mind, I have to ask the important question once again. In this timeline, is there a definite event or occurrence which can be identified as ensoulment? In other words, where the soul was inserted into the first human Adam? And the answer once again is not at all. And this is also supported by the pattern of the development of tool technology. We find that the first tools created by our ancestors were simple and primitive. As the brain became more advanced and more complicated, the tools became more sophisticated and had different uses. What the soul theorists, one of the verses that they common cite to support the idea of the presence of the soul is to be found in 15:26-27. It says there, "And when I fashioned him and completed him and breathed into him my spirit." Now, most commentators consider this to be a metaphorical statement of God endowing man with life and consciousness. In fact, chapter 15, verse 26, 27, 28 sums up the entire evolutionary history of man. The chemical stage, biological evolution, and the evolution of consciousness, erroneously translated as the soul being blown into the human being. The key point here is that of the word ruh. Now, the word ruh, the biblical meaning is that of a spirit or some kind of a life force, the soul. But if you look at the classical Arabic dictionaries, the correct definition is that of a reasoning faculty comprised in the term consciousness, which includes the thought being expressed in speech, voluntary motion, sensation, and of course the physical part of the body. So, ruh, according to the classical Arabic dictionaries and from a Quranic perspective, sums up the essence of the human being, the entire system. And when that is the physical components of the human body, especially the brain, come together in a perfect order and configuration, a dimension emerges, that of consciousness. And it's nothing to do with, as I said, some kind of a strange life force. Let me clarify something. I do not reject the idea of soul. What I reject is the traditional translation of the soul. I accept or rather to refer to it as consciousness. That is how the Quran defines it. Consciousness, as we said earlier, emerges early during embryonic life in a rudimentary form. And when the child is born and he grows up and is exposed to environmental factors, life experiences, then, you find that neural networks are laid down, foundation is formed of the mind, shaping the brain. There's a continuous dynamic interaction between the developing brain and mind. The brain expands the mind, and the mind in turn stimulates brain activity. It's a process feeding on itself. In short, therefore, consciousness or the mind is actually a personalization of the brain. There's nothing mysterious about it. Each of us has our own private, unique consciousness because each of us has a unique life story. How does the Quran deal with life after death? According to the Quran, when you die, your brain disintegrates and your body. But information, is preserved because you cannot destroy information. And God can reconstruct this or preserve this information, reconstruct it and resurrect us so that we have to give account for our life on this planet. Providing a logical basis for life after death, you may refer to my previous videos where this important subject is discussed comprehensively.